The Lord be with you. A reading from the Infancy Gospel of James. So I need to put this in context for you. It's in the middle of a story. It's like right bang in the middle of a story that's been going on for the last several weeks. And you may not have heard other parts of it or hear the end of it. So otherwise it's not going to make sense. The Infancy Gospel of James is a book that goes back to about 150 BC. And it's filling in the blanks in the other accounts of Jesus' childhood and his birth. And in fact of Mary's childhood and her birth. So the story very basically is that there's an old couple called Anna and Joachim. They're very advanced in age. They have no children. And then suddenly Anna conceives miraculously. She conceives Mary, who would be the mother of Jesus. And they dedicate her to the temple. So at the age of 3, she's sent to live in the temple. And she lives in the temple, being raised there until she's about 12 or 13. And then when she begins to menstruate, she has to be taken out of there because you can't have a menstruating woman in the temple. So there's a competition held to figure out who's going to look out for her for the rest of her life, because she's a dedicated virgin to the temple. So there's this competition to decide who takes care of Mary, and Joseph wins it. And he's very unhappy. He's an old man at this stage. He's got grown kids, and he thinks he's going to be a laughingstock with this little 12-year-old girl. And so he brings her home, and he tells the rest of the kids who are grown to look after her, he's going off on his business. He comes back after 6 months, and she's pregnant, and he's tearing his hair out. And so in the middle of the story now, she's about to give birth. And they're on their way, as you'll hear, to be registered. Now, an order came from the Emperor Augustus that everybody in Bethlehem of Judea must be enrolled in the census. And Joseph wondered, I'll enroll my sons, but what am I going to do with this girl? How will I enroll her? As my wife? I'm ashamed to do that. As my daughter? The people of Israel know that she's not my daughter. God needs to figure this out for himself. And so he saddled his donkey and had her get up on it. His son led the donkey, and Samuel brought up the rear. As they neared the 3-mile marker, Joseph turned around and saw that she was sulking. And he said to himself, perhaps the baby she is carrying is causing her discomfort. Joseph turned around again and saw her laughing and said to her, Mary, what's going on with you? 1 minute I see you laughing, the next minute you're sulking. And she replied, Joseph, it's because I imagine 2 peoples in front of me, one weeping and mourning, and the other celebrating and jumping for joy. Halfway through the trip, Mary said to him, Joseph, help me down from the donkey. The child inside me is about to be born. And he helped her down, and he said to her, where will I take you to give you some privacy, since this place is out in the open? A gospel inspired by God. So as you may or may not have remembered, today is the 3rd Sunday. So at the end of the homily, we're going to open it up as usual to question-answer discussions. I'm sure you've heard many great stories about identical twins separated at birth that have been finally reunited. So it's not just stories or it's not just anecdotes. There are actually some really important psychological studies that have tracked this. The most famous one being the Minnesota twins study that has tracked identical twins separated at birth and tracked them longitudinally. And what you find is when they're finally reunited, they have extraordinary similarities. They're how they dress, the kind of food they like, their interests. Even the people they marry, the spouses they marry, tend to have the same names as the other half-sibling is marrying. So when they're reunited, they're filled with this extraordinary connection and love for each other. So almost everything about them is identical, even though they have never been together for maybe 30 or 40 years. They dress alike. Often they have the same names given by their adoptive parents. Their tastes are the same, their interests are the same, their talents are the same. They marry men or they marry women who have the same name as the other person is marrying. And then they come together and there's this extraordinary bonding that happens. So some great stories, fascinating stories. But much more fascinating to me than that is the opposite of it. It's what happens when you have siblings who are not separated at birth, who raised all their childhood in the same family with the same parents, and then wind up being very, very separated from each other, growing apart, even to hating each other or being at war with each other, or even committing fratricide. That for me is much more extraordinary. How does it come to be that, to kind of people who share a womb and share a home wind up being enemies of each other? And the most graphic case of all, of course, is the children of Eve. Mitochondrial Eve, and there's evidence now, mitochondrial evidence, that all human beings on the planet go back to a single female in East Africa about 200,000 years ago, whom they've dubbed Mitochondrial Eve. That we all came literally from the same womb. And still, within 1 or 2 generations, we're killing each other, community killing each other. That, for me, is much more extraordinary than the notion of identical twins separated at birth who come back and fall in love with each other again. And that's what I want to focus on a little bit this morning in the homily. So I'm going to make 3 main points this morning. I'm going to talk, the first point I would call siblings separated by life. And then I'm going to talk about the notion of original life. And then I'm going to talk about, thirdly, about avatars and the morphogenetic field. So those are the 3 points I'll make this morning. So the first one, siblings separated by life. And I'm just going to dip into the scriptures in a few different places and cull some stories of, kids raised together and being very, very separated. And the first one you'll all remember, of course, is the story of Cain and Abel, the first 2 children born on planet Earth. So you have Adam and Eve, and then the first child is called Cain, and the second one is called Abel. And they grow up to be men, and one of them becomes a farmer, and the other one becomes a shepherd. And they're living their lifestyle, and then there's, at some stage, each of them brings a gift to God, and God, for some reason, decides to look with favor on the gift of the shepherd and to disparage the gift of the farmer. So this is the origin of this Oklahoma. Why can't the cowboys and the farmers be friends? It goes way, way back to the very beginning, literally, back to the beginning, right to the beginning. So for whatever reason, God decided he would accept the offering from Abel, which was a little lamb, and he would reject the offering from Cain, which was the produce of his farm. Now, there's a much older story to this, and I'll mention this in a moment. But the result was that Cain killed his brother and then gets exiled by God. Now, in actual fact, like many of the great stories in the book of Genesis, they go way, way back much further. They're tiny little, they're the distillation or the dilution of much older stories that go back to the Sumerians, the first great civilization on planet Earth that goes back to about 3,800 BC. And the story behind this is, from the Sumerians, is that this has its origin in a previous fraternal dispute between 2 of the Anunnaki, a guy called Enki and a guy called Enlil. Enki was the firstborn son of the sky god Anu, but he was born of a concubine. Enlil was the child of his own wife, but he was born much later. So the inheritance right went to the secondborn rather than the firstborn. So that's the beginning of the problem. On planet Earth, when they're finally on planet Earth and they begin agriculture and pastoral activity, one of them becomes the god of agriculture and the other becomes the god of the pastoralists, the nomads. And so Cain is the protege of one of these guys, and Abel is the protege of the other. And the dispute has to do with water and grazing, like it did with the cowboys and the ranchers. So Abel is trying to have access to water and pasture, and Cain has fenced off the land because he's a farmer and he wants to protect his crops from the sheep and something else. And so Abel breaks through the fence in order to bring his sheep down to the water, and this infuriates Cain, and this is why Cain killed Abel. So at the way back, you have this clash between brothers, resulting literally in fratricide. So that's the first story of siblings separated by life. The second story was the story we heard today. And it's the story of, so you have Abraham is married to Sarah, and they have a child in their old age, and this child is called Isaac, and Isaac marries Rebekah, and Rebekah is pregnant, and she realizes she's pregnant with twins. The 2 of them are warring inside in her womb. And as you read the account today, even as they're being born, Esau is the first one out, and he's all covered in red hair, so they call him Esau. It's a pun in Hebrew. And as the child is being born, as his ankle comes out, the other kid is holding on to his ankle. Jacob is holding on to his ankle, so they come out almost together. But Esau is the firstborn. And Esau is the beloved of his father, Isaac. But Jacob, the young one, is the beloved of the mother. And so she sets about to try to create a problem between them. So, and he's getting very, very old. Isaac sends his son to go out to hunt. Esau is a great hunter. He says, I want you to go out and prepare me a meal so that I can give you my blessing. And Esau goes off out to hunt. And Rebekah has been listening to this conversation. So she says to Jacob, I've got a plan. I'm going to kill a kid and cover your arms with the hair of the kid because your brother's a very hairy man. And you go up to your father, the father was blind at this stage, and ask him for the blessing that rightly belongs to Esau, but he won't know the difference. And so Jacob goes up to his dad and he says, Father, I cooked you some food. You know, God gave me a kill very quickly and I cooked you some food. And the father he says, you know, that's strange. He said, you know, how did you do it so quickly? And he said, God blessed me. He says, stranger, the voice sounds like the voice of Jacob, but, you know, let me feel you, my son. And so he puts out his hand, and the father feels his arm, and he says, ah, yes, that's my son Esau. So he gives him his blessing. So Jacob has stolen his brother's blessing. So that's the second great story of the animosity between siblings, separated by life. Go forward 2 generations now. So you've got Abraham, son is Isaac, and Isaac goes back to Jacob, and Jacob gives birth to 12 sons and a daughter. And the first son of Jacob is called Judah. And Judah has 3 sons of his own. And the first of these sons marries a woman called Tamar. And he dies on their wedding night. Now the Levirate rule is that if a man dies childless, his brother has to take the widow as his wife and raise up children to the dead brother. And so now the second brother marries this woman Tamar, and he dies as well. At this stage, Judah is getting really upset. He only has 1 son left, a young fella. So Tamar comes to him and says, I want your 3rd son. And Judah says, you know, hold it a sec, he's real young. Why don't you go back to your father's house for a few years, and when he's of age, then you can have him as your husband. So she goes back to her father's house. And the young son, a guy called Shelah, grows up, and there's no sign of him getting married to Tamar. And Tamar is really upset about this. So she hits upon a plan. She knows that Judah is going for the sheep shearing to a particular town. So she dresses up as a prostitute, and she hangs out at the crossroads. And Judah is passing by, and he sees this good-looking lady, and he says, how about it? And she says, how much will you pay me? And he said, I will give you a kid from the flock. That's a pun, of course, as well. I'll give you a kid from the flock. And she said, okay, but where's the kid? And he said, I don't have it with me now. So she said, well, I need some kind of a token. How can I trust you? So he gives her his walking staff. And then they have a little bit of fun together, and he goes off without his walking staff, and she goes off, and she's pregnant. And she's pregnant with twins again. So about 5 or 6 months later, Judah gets a report, your daughter-in-law, Tamar, has been playing the harlot, and she's pregnant. And Judah gets really upset about this. This is terrible. She's disgracing the family name. She needs to be taken out and stoned to death. So as they're taking her out to stone her to death, she says, yes, I agree, but the man who impregnated me is the man to whom this staff belongs. So they look at the staff, and there's Judah's name on the staff. And he realizes the jig is up. That's his fault. Okay, no fun. And she gives birth to twins, a guy called Zerah and a guy called Perez Zerah. And the same thing is happening. They're wrestling with each other inside the womb. And it's not exactly a breech delivery, but what the hand of one of the children comes out of the womb first as the midwife is trying to deliver them. A hand comes out of the womb. And the midwife ties a purple strand, a piece of thread on it. But the child withdraws his hand, back in again, and the other guy comes out first, and then the guy with the string on his hand comes out. So Zerah and Perez are the name of the 2 kids. So there's this extraordinary struggle goes on again. So you got this idea constantly of the struggle between the firstborn and the secondborn, who gets to succeed and who doesn't get to succeed. And then you have the story of Mary this morning, a strange story of Mary in the infancy gospel of James. So this little girl is sitting on the donkey, and she's about to deliver, and Joseph looks back. One of his sons is leading the donkey, and the other guy is behind it. The guy behind it is named. The guy in front isn't. The guy in front is probably James, the brother of Jesus. And the other kid is behind it. And Joseph looks back, and at one stage she's really sulking. And at the other stage she's breaking her heart laughing. And he said, Mary, what's going on with you? You know, I look back 1 minute and you're sulky, you look back another minute and you're breaking your heart laughing. What's up? And she said, I have this vision of two different kinds of people, some of whom are going to be really, really happy at this birth, and some of whom are going to be really, really angry about this birth. So in some senses, it's looking forward to the kinds of reactions that Jesus is going to elicit in his audiences. That for some people, Jesus will really be the advent of Christ consciousness, and for other people, he'll be a heretic and a blasphemer. And so Mary somehow is realizing this. So there's the notion of siblings separated by life. And the most egregious form of it, completely obviously, is that we live in a world of 7 billion people, all of whom have come from the same life force, all of whom have been literally birthed from a mitochondrial Eve. And within 2 or 3 generations, we're fighting with each other, we're killing each other, and there's all this kind of genocide. So that's my first point. So I'm going to back up then and talk about the notion of original life. I have this theory that there is only one human being on planet Earth. And I call this human being Homo originalis. And to kind of speak about it metaphorically, it's like this. Inside your body, you have 50 trillion cells. 50 trillion cells. Every single one of them which contains all of your DNA. So literally, if you could extract a single cell from your body and extract the DNA from it, you could reproduce your entire self. If you get back to the original cells. So any one of these cells contains all of the information to be you. But in the course of time, they have specialized, this extraordinary community of cells, 50 trillion of them, they've specialized and they've agreed to particular kinds of tasks. So some cells have specialized as eye cells, some cells have specialized as kidney cells, some have specialized as saliva cells, some have specialized as neurons, but all of them have the ability to be anything that's needed. But for purposes of specialization, they've decided each to take different kinds of jobs. But you could take any cell from any part of the body and create the entire experiment as well. Now, I think that that's true of the human species, 7 billion of us. But if you could extract the essence of any human being, and I'm not talking about biochemical DNA. I'm talking about the spirit, the underlying metaphysical reality, the essence or the soul of what it means to be a member of Homo Sapiens Sapiens. If you could extract that essence, you could take any one of us and you could recreate the entire experiment of Homo Sapiens Sapiens. So in that sense, I claim that there is only one human being. And that therefore, when we look at each other, we are literally looking at ourselves. And this is why, in my opinion, any conflict, and particularly any war, is an autoimmune disease. It is the inability of the organism to recognize itself. It is to create some kind of cancer with it. So any time there is violence in a system, any time there is internecine warfare, anytime even there's dispute between 2 different people, it's an autoimmune disease. It is my inability to recognize myself. And this is what Christ means by loving your enemy or loving your neighbor. There is only one of us. There is only literally Homo originalis in 7 billion different guises. But it's the same essence, the same spirit underlying all of us. I want to kind of back it up even further and make the claim that not only is there just one human being on the planet, Homo originalis, there is only one animal on the planet, whom I would call animal originalis. There literally only one animal life form on the planet. And so if you go back further on the genealogical tree, at some stage there was a point before the primates split off into, chimpanzees and monkeys and hominids. So we were united back there. You back further in the tree, and the further back you go, the more you realize that there was only one animal, that there was only one kind of life form that perambulated about. And that you could take the essence of any of these, the spirit of that, and you could recreate the entire history of evolution on planet Earth. I would extrapolate even further and go back and make the claim that there is only one life on planet Earth, vita originalis, that literally everything goes back to life itself, the principle of spirit self-emanating into manifestation, that there is only one source of all that is. And that therefore any kind of violence against any life form or any other species also is a form of an autoimmune disease, or inability to recognize God in other guises. So at some stage you back up, where do you go to? You have to go before the beginning. Before there was a beginning, there was no time. So at some stage, you can't just keep going back further and further and further and say, well, when was the beginning of life? Was it panspermia, as Francis Crick claimed, that life on planet Earth was actually seeded from other parts of the universe in specially created spacecraft? That was Francis Crick's, the father of DNA. That was his claim, that it came from elsewhere. And that theory is called panspermia. But you can only go back so far and then ask, well, where did that come from? And at some stage, you have to jump dimensions. You have to realize that you have to go to a place or a state of consciousness in which you have to transfer and transform. You have to go beyond merely chronological causation. Chronological causation will only take you back so far, and then it's turtles all the way down. It is nonsensical. So there's a jump of dimensions. There's a whole different understanding, a whole metaphysical leap in order to understand where this entire thing came from. So we keep backing up, and we find we get closer and closer to God. Now, cancer, by any other name, is an autoimmune disease in which somehow particular cells in an organism fail to recognize that they're part of the organism. And this is true not just at the cellular level, it is true sociologically, it is true at a global level, that whenever a life form fails to recognize the commonality of all other life forms, there's a cancer on the planet, whether that's internecine warfare, interglobal conflict, whatever it is. So all of that is an invitation, it seems to me, to reunification and re-healing. Because spirit somehow can even use those kinds of bifurcations and that kind of animosity to develop compassion and free will and freedom. If we had been creatures who didn't have any ability to make choices, we would be literally automatons. And there are automatons, there are life forms that just respond to life kind of automatically or instinctively. But at some stage, a species arrives which is able to think self-reflectively and make choices. And now we have the possibility of developing empathy and compassion and free will and ultimately freedom. Freedom is very different from free will. Free will is the ability to do as I choose. Freedom is the ability to do as God chooses. So the only truly free person is the person who chooses the good. To the extent that I choose less than good, I'm addicted to some form of personal, idiosyncratic, individual greed. Only when I choose the good am I truly free. And so there's a movement from compassion to free will to freedom. Now, free will is meaningless unless there are choices among which to choose. And so as part of the darkness and part of the shadow is precisely the evolutionary step needed in order for us to develop compassion and free will and freedom. But there needs to be a reunification of it. So if I were to use a kind of a dumb example, imagine you're trying to climb up a very steep ladder. So the distance between the rungs is fairly steep. You have to really, really step up to get to the next one. So you start off on the ground with both feet together on the ground. But if you're going to climb, you have to separate your feet. You have to step up maybe with your left foot onto the first rung. And that's the differentiation stage. Now you bring your next foot up and you plant it side by side, and that's the reintegration stage. If you want to go higher again, you've got to separate a second time and reach, and then reintegrate, and then separate a third time, and then reintegrate. And so evolution is a question of subsequent separations and reintegrations until finally we reach Christ consciousness itself, and then we arrive at our destination and both feet are together once more. And that's the journey. We're at a stage where differentiation is inviting us back into reintegration. But differentiation can lead to dissociation. It can totally fragment. And that's the danger at any stage. When you step away from the unification, you can step into differentiation that will lead into reintegration, or you can step into dissociation that destroys the whole exercise. And that's where we find ourselves as a human species at this stage. The feet have been separated as we climb the ladder of evolution, but we're reaching the top, and the invitation will be to step off into dissociation completely and fragmentation, or to step into reintegration where we realize there is only one of us, there is only God, there is only Source. Which brings me to my third point. I'm going to call it avatars and the morphogenetic field. At some stage, on every planet that's thrown up life, or any dimension that's thrown up life, at some stage, a self-aware species will arise, inevitably. If evolution continues long enough, at some stage on every planet, a self-aware species will arise. Now, immediately when that happens, it seems to me spirit extends an invitation. And the invitation is to become conscious co-creators of the future evolution. It transitions from the evolution of consciousness into conscious evolution. They're very different. The first stage of evolution is where spirit is guiding the entire process and moving consciousness forward slowly by slowly. But at the stage that a fully self-aware species arises, the equation changes. And now spirit invites us to be co-creators in this process. And now it's conscious evolution and not just the evolution of consciousness. When that invitation is extended to a species, there's one of two responses. A response of hubris or a response of humility. The response of hubris is to be filled and inflated with pride, and it always leads to self-destruction. It inevitably winds up with some kind of a nuclear disaster or some kind of ecological disaster in which the species destroys themselves. They destroy their host first, and then they kill themselves subsequently because there's no host left to sustain them. So once we get the invitation to become co-creators, conscious co-creators of the future, we can either go hubris and self-destruct or go humility and self-transcend. This becomes the invitation then to move into a totally different way of being. And some great thinkers of the past have given different names to that. Jesus would have called it the kingdom of heaven. The kingdom of heaven is not that we die and then we go to be with God. The kingdom of heaven is that we transcend as a species and we become Christ-conscious beings. Or the Buddha would have called this nirvana. Nirvana is not some place you go to when you die. Nirvana is a shift in consciousness, so you understand here and now what love and beauty and compassion are about. Pierre Teilhard de Chardin would call it the omega point, the point at which all human evolution begins to come together into the realization that there is only one of us. And Sri Aurobindo would call it the super-conscious human being, that we develop a super-consciousness. So that becomes the invitation. Now, in the process of this, there are morphogenetic fields set up. A morphogenetic field is simply that when nature wants to throw up some new kind of life form, it creates some kind of a metaphysical template that it interfaces with material reality. It creates a template, and energy flows through this template, and then a new form comes into being. And when sufficient members of that form have come into being, it becomes easier and easier and easier to make that journey. And so, for instance, as they say, like to say in biology, ontogeny recapitulates phylogeneity, that the evolution of a single member of a group reenacts the evolution of the entire group itself. And so, for instance, what took us 3.7 billion years of evolution on this planet to go from single-cell creatures to becoming sea creatures, to becoming amphibians, to becoming land creatures, to becoming Homo erectus, to becoming Homo sapiens, the average little child now knocks that off in 9 months. What took us 3.7 billion years, we can now accomplish in 9 months because the morphogenetic field is set up. So when a morphogenetic field is set up and sufficient people have moved through it, it becomes easier and easier and easier. I'm going to revisit a few examples I've given you in the past. The 4-minute mile. It was really believed for a long, long time in the 20th century that 4 minutes represented some kind of a biological barrier, that there was no way that human beings could run a mile faster than 4 minutes. They couldn't do it. And then one day, in 1954, a young student from Oxford called Roger Bannister broke the 4-minute mile for the first time ever. And within 3 or 4 months, 30 other runners had done it. He had created a morphogenic field, and everybody else was able to follow him through that. I've given you the example of the famous story in England in the 1930s of a group of birds, a group called the Blue Tits, and they figured out a way how to puncture milk bottles tops and drink milk. When the milkman came around and he delivered milk outside your door, and he put 5 or 6 bottles there, these particular birds, the blue tits, learned how to puncture the aluminum cap and drink the top 2 inches of the milk bottles. Within a few months, it had spread all over England. All the blue tits in England were doing the very same thing. It spread to the continent of Europe, and they started doing it in Holland. And then in 1939, when World War II started, Holland stopped delivering milk to households. So it went on hold for 7 years. Milk was not delivered for 7 years. Now, the lifespan of a blue tit is 3 years. As soon as the war was ended and they started delivering milk bottles again, the blue tits in Holland started immediately to puncture the tops and drink the milk. How? Because the morphogenetic field had been established, and this fact that 3 generations of them hadn't participated didn't make a damn difference. I mentioned another example to you. It's a well-known, scientifically attested fact that if you're a crossword puzzle aficionado and you get your daily crossword puzzle, it is much easier to solve the crossword puzzle in the evening than it is in the morning. Or better still, the next day. And I'm not talking about cheating, that you're looking at the results from yesterday's paper. The fact that thousands and maybe millions of minds have been working on this puzzle throughout the day creates a morphogenetic field which makes it easier and easier for people who are doing it in the evening to solve the problem than the people who are doing it in the morning. So there's a morphogenetic field set up. As soon as any group begins to do stuff, the more of us that do it, the easier it becomes. Now this is beautiful and this is dangerous because there is a morphogenetic field of violence. And when a lot of people engage in violent behavior, there literally is a morphogenetic field set up in which it becomes easier and easier for other people to engage in acts of violence. And therefore, there must be some kind of response to that. What is the response? That's the question. If we can only meet violence with equal or greater violence, whether that's economic violence, or it's ecological violence, or it's military violence, whatever it is. If we can only meet violence with an equal or greater amount of violence, all we're doing is we're literally creating a bigger and badder morphogenetic field for violence to be easier and easier for more and more of us. So what is the difference? What's the response? It is to create a different kind of morphogenetic field. It is to create a morphogenetic field in which we are developing equal and greater amounts of creativity and compassion and resilience and thoughtfulness so that we overwhelm the other one, not that we take them on their own terms. This is not to say that we don't need to dismantle dysfunctional systems. We certainly do. This is not to say that we do not need to disenfranchise and disempower dysfunctional leaders. We certainly do. But we must make all of these people as individuals, no longer as leaders. They don't deserve to be leaders, but they need to be included as members of a movement forward into life and light and compassion. At the moment, we have 1% dominating the 99%. We have a violent morphogenetic field in which 99% are suffering at the hands of 1%. As long as anybody is losing, everybody is losing. If we could reverse that equation and create a situation where 99% of the people are benefiting and 1% of the people are suffering, there would still be violence in the system. It would just be a question of time before that seeded further discontent and revolution and violence. And so everybody has to become part of the solution. I'm not saying we have to leave them in power. We don't. They need to be disempowered of their leadership positions, and we need to dismantle dysfunctional systems. But as we create functional systems and as we throw up real leaders of love and light, we need to realize that the bad guys are also children of God, and they need to be included somehow so that they too are being invited to awaken and to be compassionate and to loving. As long as there's any sore left in the system will infect itself. And this is the great movement, it seems to me, into cosmic consciousness or Christ consciousness. It has to be done in love. But there are 4 ways to love. When you look at the example of Christ, you can love by confirmation, you can love by complementarity, you can love by compensation, or you can love by challenge. And I'll give you just a dumb example, say from football. If you're playing in a football on the football team, and some guy scores a try, then you can love that person by affirming what they've just done. Way to go, attaboy. So that's one way of loving some person. Really approving of their success. The second level is the complementarity. We're all members of the same team. So not everybody can be the quarterback every day, but every one of us has a place in the team. And it is only by the team operating as a team that we can really be successful. That's the second way of loving. It is loving through the complementarity of being team players. The third way is loving by compensation. So somebody drops the ball, literally drops the ball, and somebody else rushes in and grabs it. And so we make up for the mistakes that others begin to make. That's the third way of loving. It is to compensate for the mistakes of others on the team. And the fourth way is to sideline somebody who thinks that he owns the ball and wants to hold on to the ball for the whole game. That person can't be on the team for a while. They need to be sidelined for a period of time. And that's the situation in which we find ourselves right now, it seems to me. So the invitation of our times feels to me, it is not about reacting to violence with greater or equal violence. It is about responding to this opportunity at this stage of human history of really moving into love and involving everybody in that process and involving everybody to be members of the team of Christ consciousness. So I'll open it up to question and answer discussions. Okay. Sorry? Patricia?
I wanted to know if someone is in one morphogenetic field and someone else is in another morphogenetic field, is there a point of intersection where they can merge?
Right. It's a great question. The truth is, all of us are bathing in many, many different morphogenetic fields simultaneously. Every single one of us. The shadow doesn't just run down sociologically between one person and another or one group and another. The shadow runs through every individual among us, that every single one of us has predispositions. We live in a world of competing morphogenetic fields. So every single one of us is under these influences. So the first stage of any journey is to try to resolve the discrepancies and the divisions within myself. Before I attempt to create any kind of a sociological solution to the world's problems, I have to kind of deal first with my own intrapsychic and my own spiritual shadow material. When I'm dealing with my own shadow as an individual, then I can begin to kind of help the shadow of the group, and then the shadow of the species, and then the shadow of life itself. And so that's part of the reason why Christ says, love your enemies, because in loving your enemy, you're loving yourself. You're recognizing the shadow material inside yourself, and you're working on that piece of it simultaneously as you work with the outside. So I don't think that you can just totally clear yourself up before you start to attempt to heal the system. Otherwise, we'd be waiting 100 incarnations. We have to do it simultaneously. If prophets waited until they were perfect before they opened their mouths, there'd be no prophets among us. And so it's a simultaneous activity that we have to attend to personal evolution and personal shadow and the shadow of the group, the nation, and the species. Great, okay, I get Karen. Okay, and then Trish. Back there.
So this is that, can you hear me?
Okay.
So this, I don't exactly know how to formulate this question, but it's something to do with the relationship between DNA and the morphogenetic field.
Okay.
And whether, I tend to think that as we evolve, we're also changing our DNA.
Absolutely.
And so then when, is it a partnership between those two things? The changes that we see happening, are they coming because of the morphogenetic field? Is it the partnership of those two things?
It's a great question, Karen. And so the truth is it's a multifactorial equation. All of them interfacing with each other and with this beautifully complex, feedback system. So it's not that A causes B, which causes C, which causes D, but that A, B, C, and D, are all dancing together, all intermingling with each other. So there's very, very graphic evidence that human DNA has changed more in the last 4,000 years, literally more in the last 4,000 years than it changed in the previous 50,000 years. So something is happening to DNA. So how is DNA itself changing? The truth is, sunlight itself is constantly giving Earth data. There's more data contained in 5 minutes of sunshine than is contained in all the archives on planet Earth. Data bits as the answer to yes/no questions, literally. And so literally, the sun itself is helping the DNA process to move along. I think as well that everything we think about, everything we do as individuals, that's helping the process. There's evidence, in fact, as well that we live within cycles, within cycles, within cycles. So there's an obvious daily cycle with the Earth spins on its axis. There's an obvious lunar cycle where 29.5 Earth days, the sun waxes, the moon waxes and wanes. There's an obvious solar year where we circumambulate the sun in a period of 365.23 days. There are 5,125-year cycles. There is a 25,920-year cycle of the precession of the equinoxes, where because of the wobble of the Earth, it takes us 25,920 years before the same sign of the zodiac appears in the winter solstice sun. There's a 227 million-year cycle where we literally circumambulate the entire Milky Way galaxy as a solar system, our own little Earth and Sun. And so there are cycles within cycles within cycles. There's evidence now that the Earth itself is going through a region of space in which it's being bombarded with photons at a different level, and that this literally is affecting the DNA of the species itself. And so there are many, many, many factors, all of which are intermingling. And that's the beauty of something like, for instance, systems theory. Typically, you take a single factor and you try to calculate and predict on the basis of the graph of this factor what it's going to look like in 5 years' time. But when you have a multifactorial equation, very often the factors interact with each other. And so the results are very, very different. The timeline is speeded up very significantly. So I think there are many factors in this equation, and that, yes, literally, the DNA is shifting to accommodate this movement into Christ consciousness, and it's both the cause of and the result of Christ consciousness. Trish, and then Margaret. Can you put up a bit closer, love? Put a bit closer to your mouth, Trish.
In our spiritual evolution as a species, is there ever a time at which violence is an appropriate response to violence?
Okay, that's a brilliant question. It's a very, very ancient, very old question. Is there ever a time in our evolution in which violence is an appropriate response to violence? Violence can be regarded, in two different ways. You can look at external criteria to evaluate whether something is a violent reaction, or you can look at motivation to figure out whether violence, is the appropriate designation for a particular kind of action. My own opinion is this, that let's say to take it at as core level, is there a place, for instance, for anger in a person's evolution? I think anger is an appropriate experience in the course of moving into freedom. Suppose somebody has been wrongly imprisoned and is being tortured, and the only way they can kind of literally break out of their prison, is to marshal enough anger within the system to break through it. That may be a necessary and appropriate level of anger. However, as I said before, if we're not angry at the moment, we're asleep. Looking around the world at the moment and the way the world is being run by the leaders, if we're not angry, we're asleep. But if we stay angry, we don't become enlightened. So anger is an appropriate stage of the movement. Now, can anger justifiably result then in physical violence? And it may well be that it is appropriate, but that if anger comes from a mindset of love, is very different from anger coming from a mindset of just pure viciousness or evil. So anger, violence commensurate with the purpose of liberating somebody might be acceptable. But if I'm doing it from a really, really evil place, it's very, very different from doing it in a loving space. So, simple example. I'm visiting the schoolyard, and all of a sudden I see a guy jump out of a car with an AK-47 and stick a magazine into it. And there's a playground full of little children, and he's going to turn the gun, and kill 35 or 40 kids. Is it an appropriate level of violence to take the guy down? Let's say I'm trained in judo or whatever, and I can give him a karate chop and just knock him out, or kill him with a blow. Is it appropriate to do that? Is it justifiable? I would say yes. But am I doing this because I'm filled with anger and rage, and that's who I am? I'm a rageful person. Or I'm doing this in a soul-calculated fashion. That's a very, very different experience. Now, it's a very, very dangerous road to move onto. And so if my customary response in situations is to get angry, then that's telling me something about my core essence. If this is a very extraordinary and a very, very uncommon response to me, then it might be justifiable. But I would think, yes, there are times when the taking of a human life is an appropriate response to a human situation. Be very, 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 very rare, but I think, yes, it's possible such a situation would arise. Yeah. Margaret was first, and then Diana.
You started this morning with Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel, and Cain killing Abel, and the business of how we kill each other. Then you go back to the Sumerians.
Yes.
On Thursday night, you said we don't know, we can't go ahead until we know where we come from.
Yes.
I'm still stuck on where we've come from.
Okay.
Where we have this information about the Sumerians, and we have the Bible.
Yes.
The New Testament is 2,000 years old. I don't know how old the Old Testament is.
About 3,000. It started to be written in about 950 BC. It was in written form.
Where was the culture of the Sumerians?
Okay.
When did it come to light?
Okay. Great. Thanks, Margaret. The Sumerian civilization goes back to 3,800 BC. And it depends what you mean by coming to light. Many of the stories in Genesis, in the book of Genesis, in the Hebrew scriptures, are straight out of the Sumerian writings. They're diluted forms. The story of our creation, straight out of the Sumerians. The story of the flood, straight out of our creation. The story of the sons of God, falling in love with the daughters of men and interbreeding with them, straight out of the Sumerians. Genesis chapter 6. So a lot of the first 5 books of the Hebrew scriptures are straight out of the Sumerians. So in that sense, they came to light every time you read the Bible. But beginning about 1850, there were extraordinary excavations begun in what's called Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia would be kind of modern Iraq, the region between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. And the southern part of that was called Sumer. And some extraordinary excavations went on, including from universities in this country. For some reason, Penn State has a very powerful archaeological department. They were involved in a lot of this. Germans, English, French. So there was lots of different groups went to the Middle East in the 1850s and onwards and discovered a whole bunch of art, literally hundreds of thousands of artifacts. And primarily what are called cylinder seals were writing on cuneiform, describing these events, artifacts of various kinds, and steles, which were big standing stones which had been circumscribed with writing. Now there were several different versions of this. So there's the language of the Sumerians, we'll call it Sumerian. The Sumerians were eventually overthrown by a group called the Akkadians. The Akkadians are they're the progenitors of all the Semitic languages. All the Semitic languages go back to Akkadian. So there are lots of these artifacts written in Akkadian. Then the Akkadians were overthrown by the Babylonians, and so now it's written in Babylonian script. Then the Babylonians were overthrown by the Assyrians, and now you get it in Assyrian script. The Assyrians at this stage, the Egyptians are coming in constantly, so you get some of this in Egyptian. So you've got artifacts and writings in very various forms going back 3,800 years that were discovered from 1850 to the present moment. Now part of the problem was these were scattered all over the world. So you literally, in some cases, you had fragments of the same, script. Some of it held in Germany, some held in Pennsylvania, some held in England, and they'd never been combined. And so only maybe in the last 30 or 40 years have they begun to kind of cross-fertilize this stuff and get the fuller story of our origins. But everybody would aver, all students of civilization would aver that the first civilization this time around, the Sumerians gave us mathematics, they give us astronomy, they give us calendar making, they gave us marriage as a contract, they give us divorce as a contract, they give us adoption, they give us taxes, they give us temples, they give us priesthood.
And we knew that from the excavations?
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Right. So who's here, and then there was somebody. Diana was next, and then Patricia again.
Sean, I appreciate the invitation of loving 4 different ways of seeing myself and other people, and something about that long word about, well, anyway, that one.
Okay. That one. Gotcha.
Morphing or something.
The morphogenetic field. Right.
Okay, that one. Okay. But I'm trying to integrate all that, and I'm wondering, when I walk out this door, you said I can't just do it for myself. I have to do it systematically, from a systems approach. I need a few baby steps.
Okay, Levine. Okay. Interesting, several years ago, the Dalai Lama was asked, who does he think the next Dalai Lama is going to be? He's the 14th in this lineage. He was asked, who is the next Dalai Lama going to be? And he said, the next Dalai Lama may not be a person at all. It may be a movement or a community. And I really think that that's the future. That, in the same sense that, 3.7 billion years ago, there were only single-celled creatures on planet Earth. Bacteria or protozoa, literally, trillions of these cells, individual. And at some stage, they began to congregate into communities. And when they congregated, they then began to specialize. Some groups took charge of, thinking for the group. Some groups took charge of, making an immune system. So every cell had an immune system. It had an endocrine system. It had a nervous system. It had a brain, every single cell in your body. But when they come together, they agree to specialize and to give particular functions to particular areas. I think the future is about networking. And the beauty of this movement for me is that there are no leaders. There's no great charismatic leader standing up there leading the charge. It's a network of movements all over the planet in all different disciplines, just cross-fertilizing with each other. And so the first great step as far as the sociology of this evolutionary shift is concerned is to become part of some of these networking groups. And then as a little group to try to cross-fertilize with other groups. Are there other people who are trying to do the same thing that we're doing? We have an interest in psychology. Anybody else interested in psychology? We're interested in ecology. Anybody interested in ecology? We're interested in changing the financial system. Anybody else interested in the financial system? And so by coming together in little networks, that the movement is being created. And so the invitation is to become part of that. And the first part of that is reading the literature. You're not going to find this on Fox News. You're not going to hear about it, in the San Jose Mercury. You have to know what periodicals and what journals to read in order to become au fait with what's available and what's happening out there. Yeah. Diana was next, and then Patricia, and then Diana.
Sean, I need some clarification about the morphogenetic field.
Okay.
And I want, when you give that to me, I would like to know if there's a connection between that and intention.
Okay.
Are you talking about groups of people, conscious beings, having an intention and tipping a point whereby things change because of that intention?
Okay, brilliant. So you have two questions, really. So the first one is, what does the morphogenetic field mean? And then what's the role of consciousness in that process? Yes, intention. The morphogenetic field was a term coined by a brilliant English biologist, a guy called Rupert Sheldrake. He's still alive, and lived for a while up in actually Petaluma, part of the Institute of Noetic Sciences community. And his belief system, and he's a very, very, very well-established biologist in his own right, this notion that before any new life form arrives, there's some kind of a template created. Now, Hinduism would call this the etheric body. So there's some kind of metaphysical underpinning created before you can bring the thing into manifestation. To use a kind of an example, it would be like, you want to build a house for yourself. The first stage is you've got an idea in your mind of what kind of house you want. Second stage is you go to an architect, or maybe you do it yourself, and you start making drawings of, I want the kitchen to be here, this particular size, I want windows to be here, I want an upstairs to look like this. So you do a drawing of your home. The third stage is you assemble the physical materials necessary to build the house. And then the next stage is you assemble a crew who will look at the blueprint, take the materials, and then create the house out of it. So the final product is a three-dimensional reality in which you live. But that's the end product of something that happened in your mind. And the second stage of that process was the blueprint. So the morphogenetic field literally is the blueprint. It is the blueprint that nature creates, and then subsequently gathers molecular elements, and then finally produces a new species, whether it's a flower or a hominid or whatever it is. And so literally it is the blueprint for life. It is the non-physical component, or the metaphysical information matrix out of which manifestation occurs. That making sense to you?
Almost.
Okay. Just think of the blueprint piece of it.
Nature's blueprint?
Yes. And nature is just a thinly disguised source or spirit.
So I'm not thinking of plants and animals and their coexistence and their interrelationships. I'm not thinking of that kind of nature. I'm thinking of that kind of nature that involves.
Think of the intelligence behind the form. God, source, whatever you want to, yeah. Okay, so the second part of your question then is, what is the role of intention in this process? Right. So up to now, on this planet, at least to the best of our knowledge, that process has been unconscious. Some kind of other forces driving it, yeah, maybe spirit, maybe nature, whatever word you want to give to it, but with the evolution of a self-aware species, and I believe this happens in every planet that throws up life, with the evolution of a self-aware species, now we can become conscious co-creators, and that's where intention comes in. Intention is the ability to change the blueprint. So you get your blueprint back from the architect, and you say, this is really, really good, but you know what? I don't want a window there, I want the window over there. And I want cupboards along this wall here, and I really prefer if the stairs were someplace else. So now you can get to tweak the blueprint. So your intention is now influencing the house as it actually gets to be constructed. And that's what intention is. Intention, either conscious intention or unconscious, there are two kinds of intention. Unconscious intention is the urges within us that allow us to think particular thoughts, speak particular words, act in particular ways, and they influence the future. But there's a conscious intentionality in which I become self-aware, and I know what I'm thinking, and I choose what I'm saying, and I make a decision about how I'm choosing to act, and then intention is much more powerful. So intention is a hugely important part of this process. And this is why Christ would say, for instance, you will be held accountable for every idle word. This was not a punitive statement where Christ is saying God is up there with a ledger and he's writing down that you said a 4-letter word. He's not talking about that. He's saying every word you speak, every thought you have, you'll be held accountable for because it's going to manifest in some way. So be really, really careful what you're thinking about, what you're saying, what you're doing, because you're going to create it. Either in this, in the next moment of this life, or in a parallel universe, or in a subsequent incarnation, but you will definitely reap the whirlwind and the harvest of what you're thinking, what you're saying, and what you're doing. So intentionality is a huge part of this. So there's Patricia, and then the other Patricia. Sorry, and then Jane. Okay.
This is on the tail of what Margaret was talking about. I think in general, it seems that we're taught mainstream education or whatever is kind of almost set in stone based on really old information. And if this is really documented evidence, why is it not out there for everybody to know about?
Okay. It is. You'd have to know where to look. Literally, I'm not being facetious. It's, well, there are literally hundreds and maybe thousands of websites and books and journals dedicated to this material, but if you don't know about them, you're not going to be able to delve. And you know better than most. You've been delving into this for several years. You've had access to a lot of this stuff. So it is there, but people haven't been taught where to look or how to look. We've been blinkered and blinded by mainstream media into thinking this is the reality. There's only one state of consciousness. It's waking state of consciousness, and we'll give you a non-representative subsample of the events of this waking consciousness and pretend like they're representative, and then we'll spin them according to some kind of a political agenda, and then you don't even have to think. We'll tell you what to think, and we'll tell you what the answers are to what you don't have to think. Yeah. The other Patricia, and then Jane. Yeah.
Sean, you're talking about blueprints.
Yes.
To create the morphogenetic field.
Yes.
And I think that you actually gave us some help on that
Okay.
when you talked about the 4 actions of love,
Okay.
confirmation down to challenge.
Yes.
And my question is, I understand 1, 2, and 3
Okay.
really well.
Okay.
I don't understand how challenge and love go together.
Yeah.
I don't understand.
And it's a very important piece of the puzzle, because otherwise love winds up being just this kind of anemic, plastic response to life. I'm not saying that there aren't occasions when it is important to confirm. There are. There are occasions when it's important to be complementary to. There are. There are occasions when it's important to be compensatory. There are. But there's also times when it is very important to be challenging. And you look at the life of Jesus. you know, and he certainly represented this in spades. He stood up to the Pharisees, and he called them on their crap, and he called a spade a spade. You take a Buddhist teacher, you know, typically, and you guys asleep at the wheel, and you bang him in the head to wake him up to his meditation. There are times when it is very important to learn how to confront. But if you confront with, you know, anger in your heart rather than alignment driving your actions, there's a very different result. So if it's just driven out of anger in my heart, then it's just two, you know, misaligned people, each trying to force their own particular agenda on the other. If I'm coming out of a really aligned place, then my anger may be no less passionate, but it is not driven by a kind of this egocentric need to impose my way on your lifestyle. But it becomes really important. Otherwise, we're faced with dysfunctional systems and corrupt leaders who are in positions of authority and won't be, you know, requested out of it. Please, please stop, you know, destroying the environment. Who's going to listen to that? You have to create some kind of a challenge, you know, where it hurts somewhere. These guys are going to have to hurt somewhere before they're going to change. So, although I personally, you know, I probably sign 9 or 10 different, you know, petitions every day online. Part of me thinks, why am I writing to the kind of the CEO of the Board of America to please, 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 you know, take less than a $3 million bonus this year? Please do us all a favor. Take a $2.5 million bonus instead. I'm thinking, what the hell are you thinking about? You know, I'm going to ask him to take a lesser bonus. It doesn't help a whole lot. There needs to be some kind of a pinch goes on to force people to realize, you know, it's not to my benefit anymore to be taking $3 million bonus because, you know, people are taking their money out of my bank. And so, and that's, in some sense, that's what I mean by challenging the system. You want to follow on?
I think that's one sphere. I'm so concerned with the day-to-day sphere of
Okay.
my own personal
Yes, yes,
and my interactions
yes,
with everybody else.
yes.
And that
Okay.
issue of being so careful that challenge doesn't
Gotcha.
come from a place of egocentric
Brilliant.
need
Yes,
control the situation.
yes. That's a great.
I think that the
Okay.
morphogenetic field
Okay.
sort of starts here.
Good, okay. So I'll give you just a very simple exercise, Patricia, to address that issue right on. I'll give you 2 postulates and say to you, if you can embrace these 2 postulates, how would that change things? If you really, really believed that you are an eternal being who was never born and can never die, postulate number 1, and if you really, really believe that you volunteered for life on planet Earth at this stage of human history, if you really believe those 2 pieces, how would you now respond to this current situation, whatever this current situation is? A personal issue, you know, an interpersonal dynamic, whatever it is. How would you respond if you really, really believe in the core of your own being, these 2 postulates? And, you know, it becomes a really extraordinarily, a great GPS system. It will really totally change. Because you can't act out of anger if, you know, if you embrace those 2 pieces. You're totally aligned. You know who you are. You know why you've come, and therefore now this action needs to be consonant with those 2 realizations. Then that would help immediately to determine, is this just egoic anger, or is this just coming out of my alignment? Jane, you get your microphone, Pat? Okay, so we'll take one more question after that, and then we'll fold it, guys. Okay.
Okay, I'm used to skipping the microphone.
Okay.
Of the 99%, we're not all looking at the same
Yes.
solutions.
Yes.
I find it's really easy to, and I'm hearing a lot of people I believe are my fellow travelers saying to the other half of the other 99%, you have nothing to say that's worth me hearing. But if part of Christ is authority, then other people with Christ consciousness, it follows that they also have authority, even when I don't like what they're saying, that there's somewhere truth that deserves some kind of deep respect, not just, okay, I'll shut up until it's my turn to talk. But it's so hard to see what's right when people are, how do you see the true truth coming from what appear to be idiots?
Okay, absolutely. It's a great question. It's a great question. There's a great Native American Indian notion they divide everything into 4 pieces. 4 is the sacred number for many shamanistic cultures. And so, north, east, south, and west, there's the 4 vocations of the seer, the warrior, the teacher, and the healer. So they divide stuff into 4. And they divide this continent into 4. And the west is called, and I'm not punning, it's called the place of confusion. Literally. And what they say about that is, confusion is the field of all possibility. And when we collapse confusion down too quickly to a specific outcome, we impoverish the possibilities. And so it becomes really, really important for us. And it's very difficult for us as Westerners, to stay with confusion. We find it very, very unsettling, very frustrating. We want immediate solutions and an immediate outcome. It becomes really, really important to be able to sit with confusion long enough to allow spirit to percolate through the system and then indicate, of all the possibilities, here is the optimal one now, and that we can get behind it with consensus of the whole group. So trying to foist an immediate outcome on this movement at the moment for me feels premature. It is wanting to kind of, it's like we're so, in the West, we are so uncomfortable with silence that we immediately want to break it and create conversations. And it becomes really important, the Native American people says, stay in the confusion. Stay long enough for Wakantanka, for great spirit to tell you, what you need to do. Not for egos battling with each other, to find out, can we get a 51% agreement on this and then plunge ahead. Okay. It's 11:05 because I'll talk all morning. So maybe just get a show. Do you want to continue for another 5 minutes, or we have enough of it at this stage? Who has enough of it? Put up your hand. Okay. We'll call it. Repeat the question. I'm just wondering, I'll talk all morning. I don't mind talking whatsoever. But I don't want to tire people out. We still have to continue with Mass this morning. We've got another hour of liturgy ahead of us. So I don't want just to tire people out. I want people to enjoy these 3rd Sundays of the month. So they don't say, oh my gosh, the 3rd Sunday is going to go on forever. So I think the best thing, hold at this stage. We can talk, individually afterwards or at the end of Mass. But I don't want to just tire people out with this. So before we continue with our offertory, offering the offering gifts, let's offer each other a sign of our peace.